I'm here with Rush, head coach of the Dallas Fuel, and of course, Dear, assistant general manager of the Dallas Fuel, who graciously will provide the translations for us. And we're sitting here pretty much as the play-ins are happening at an interesting time because, of course, playoffs are upon us. And we wanted to catch up a little bit about the season and how Rush thinks about it, and then also, of course, going into playoffs in particular. So I guess the first question after such a season, which you once again won, is to ask what you generally thought about the Dallas Fuel's performance in 2022.
To be honest with you, I haven't really put much thought into that because technically we're not done with our 2022 run. So we still have our playoffs. Yeah, I haven't really thought about it, but I would say that we were successful half of the time. Same as last year, applies to this year because we were able to maintain the top of the standings in the West over the half time. So I think right now what we just have to focus on is finishing strong in the playoffs and make sure that I can say the same about the playoffs as well, that it was successful.
Which regular season was harder, season 4 or season 5?
아무래도 이제 작년이 좀 더 어려웠던 것 같아요. 올해는
I
작년만큼은
haven't really
아니었고,
felt that it was as challenging this
작년이
year.
좀 더 어려웠던 것 같아요.
Nice. What, from a coaching perspective, how does Overwatch 2 compare? Is that harder or has that become easier?
So that's actually a completely different question that I could think of compared to the last question. So Overwatch 1, as you already know, has been out for a while. So we have experience coaching Overwatch 1 for a couple of years. Of course, at the very start, it's difficult. And I could say Overwatch 2 is we're at like the very start of the game. So at the very beginning of our coaching Overwatch 2, and I would say it's still difficult because my experience coaching Overwatch 1 was pretty much the same thing. So there were many things that we have to get used to when we first start coaching a new game, but it's just that Overwatch 1 over time it just became so simple. There was not a lot of options to choose from. It felt like everything was already chosen due to the lack of patching and like new heroes. So given that Overwatch 2 has new heroes and many new things that we have to consider, and given that it hasn't really been that long since the launch, there's a lot more to think about. So I would say that as of now, Overwatch 2 is definitely more difficult to coach.
Makes sense. Now, the game has moved to 5v5, and of course, only one tank is lacking. It feels like a lot of power is now in that one tank. Does that mean tank is now the most important role? Has it really gained importance in Rush's mind?
Yeah, so tanks are very important, but to be honest with you, for Overwatch 2, I feel like mainly it really depends on the DPS because no matter how good your tank is, if the DPS isn't doing well, then it's really hard to win the game in Overwatch 2.
Now, it's very interesting because if we look at the stats that your team put up, basically a lot of the offensive team stats, such as who gets the most kills, who gets does the most damage, who does the most eliminations, in comparison to other teams, your tanks do more. And generally speaking, the teams that have so much damage and kill share on their tanks as you guys do are generally pretty underwhelming. Those are the LA Valiants, those are the Paris Eternals. Toronto Defiant gets there, but nobody has that much success. So what is different about the Dallas Fuel that you get so much value out of your tank in comparison to, you know, the San Francisco Shock, where it really seems like, okay, Proper is hard carrying?
So I think it's really just the difference in the dynamic of each teams. So I think our team in particular, we definitely do take care of our tanks a lot better than other teams. So while our tank is able to sustain and survive for a long time, it enables our DPS to do various different things, all the things that they want to do. So I think it's really comes down to what's called synergy. We have good synergy, so that allows our tanks to do well, which it creates a chain effect of our DPS doing really well. So I'm aware that our DPS doesn't seem that they might be doing much as compared to the DPS in other top tier teams, but that's because those teams actually funnel their DPS and they really play around their DPS. So other than that, I feel like we definitely have DPS players who do just as much as the players that you mentioned from other top tier teams. It's just that when you talk about those other teams that have similar stats to our tanks, it's because they haven't really properly executed how they're supposed to be playing. So even though their tanks have better stats, uh, their overall standing is so low.
For sure. And I want to talk about DPS in a second, but for now it makes sense to stay on the tanks. And here we have an interesting case because I think at least the community talks about the chances for Hanbin as an MVP candidate. Could you talk about what Hanbin brings to the team and maybe what the value of Hanbin is outside the server?
So I would say the proper word to use is he is a reliable player. So amongst our DPS and support, he's right in the middle as a tank. And no matter what we're trying to achieve, he's there and is able to just stand his own ground. He is able to do pretty much everything that a tank is supposed to do. He can push or maybe pull and also take care of the team. So given that he's able to do everything, I feel like just looking at the league and this season, he is really the core of what we were able to uh, utilize in order to achieve all the things that we want to do. So he is pretty much like the balance. He is able to execute what he needs to do in like both the attack and like defense of a map or something like that. So he's overall just a very reliable like a pillar.
Yeah. Now, when Hanbin wasn't in and you guys had Fearless in, it made sense because it seemed to be a Winston meta, but it was also a time when you arguably had your weakest stages. So was that the right decision in hindsight? And is it just based on what Hanbin brings to the table also in comms that the performance dipped, or is there another reason?
The way each player will define the game is very different. So the way they look at the game may be different from another. So I feel like whenever we swap players, it's to achieve different goals and play it in a different way. And normally when we come up with a strategy, there's a set thing that we were supposed to be doing, but it's just that maybe we weren't able to execute it properly. And I don't think that's really difference in skills or comms or anything else, but just a difference in style and difference in being able to make it work.
Sure. Now, talking about DPS, I think when you guys picked up Edison, it was an interesting choice because on paper, I mean, you wanted probably like a star player there. Edison, definitely reliable starter, maybe not someone that was necessarily thought of as like a top tier hit scan or something like this. And still you picked him up. And I think over the season, most people were convinced that Edison still probably right now is playing the best Overwatch he's ever played in the Overwatch League. What did you see in Edison that maybe other coaches didn't?
So even now, I wouldn't really consider him the top tier hit scan, compared to, let's say, like someone that we have worked with in the past, like XC, or any other traditional hit scan players who are doing really well in the league. Compared to them, he might uh, be a little lacking, but he is still a very versatile player. He's also someone that I've been looking at quite closely from the start. So he looked like a player who has high potential when he first started out his career in the league in Overwatch. And I personally just think that he has been walking down the wrong path in the past 2 years in the league. And so even during the start of our season, he seemed a little lost, but he is gradually becoming a better player, and he definitely has potential to do even better from now on as well. So I think that's what I saw in him when I first picked him up.
What do you think are the things that he had breakthroughs on? Like, why is he better now? And what did he specifically get better on this season?
So in the past, I would say if I could use the word carry potential, the ability to enable your team to win the entire team fight, I think that's what he was lacking in the most. And now we can tell that it has become better. And he is definitely at a point where he has the ability to allow the team to win the team fight.
Makes sense. Now, someone who always had higher carry potential is, of course, Sparkle, who I think in past seasons was probably your superstar player. This year, maybe less so, but also just because you seem to have more star player potential on a lot of roles now. How do you think this season went for Sparkle? Were you satisfied?
So his overall performance, I wouldn't say is too different from the past. It's just that there are other options that we have been utilizing at the right time. So we've been changing our swapping players in and out. I think that's probably why you haven't really been able to see as much of his playtime, and in turn, you might not see that he has been performing just as well. So just thinking about his performance during Kickoff Clash when we were the runner-up and when we won the title in Toronto, I know that he did well. There's really nothing that he did worse or anything like that. So I feel like he's pretty much the same.
Right. Now, you have a full 4 DPS slot roster, and one of the more interesting pickups, once again, was Guriyo. I think that was someone that not too many people had their eye on. Why did you guys pick him up, and did he fill the role that you saw him slipping into this season?
So I don't think he achieved what I initially had in mind. So there's actually a really good reason behind that. It's that to go over why I picked him up first, we were actually originally thinking of just sticking with 3 DPS players when I first created this roster. But during our tryouts, there was someone who stood out who was very interesting and had been, this one player that was very intriguing. So that was Guriyo, and he was someone I wanted to pick up because I wanted to look at him in long term and develop him as a good player. But given that Overwatch 2 launched quite late, given that we didn't have access to that the game to give players resource to kind of get more practice from, there were limitations to actually getting him to a spot where I wanted him to get to. So developing a player requires a lot of resources, but for us to continue using him in scrims and matches, there's just so many things that we have to consider. So I don't think he took the right steps, the proper steps to becoming a good player, and unfortunately the season has already ended, and that's why I say that he hasn't achieved what I wanted him to achieve yet, which is quite a shame for that player, and I feel a little regretful as well. But I still believe in the player that he can become from now on, as long as he puts in the effort.
Now, you got Sparkle, who we all know what he's capable of, flex DPS. You have Edison, who now is slipping into his carry potential, is also a hit scan player, but also can go onto the Genji. You have Guriyo, who's sort of like a side project, an interesting player that you wanted to slot in. What kind of a puzzle piece is Doha then?
So the initial answer was the instant answer that popped out was a bench warmer, but he is kidding. So Doha, compared to Sparkle, they have a lot of parts where they overlap, and it's just that Doha is probably the best at adapting to all the changes because the game is always changing, and he tends to fill in for wherever we need him the most. So he's always there to kind of fill in for what we lack in. So I think if I'm correct, in the Overwatch League stats, Doha, every team fight that Doha has been in, I think it was like, we don't exactly remember which stat it is. It's like team fight, the win rate. He whenever he's in the roster, he's starting, he made sure that we're the number one. We were number one in that stat. So he has been doing really well. And whenever we need him, he kind of performs. So I would say maybe he's considered as like our joker pick per se. So I'm sure Doha is desperate to play more and cannot wait to be on stage, but he has been following our team's vision quietly. So I'm just honestly very grateful for him as a player.
If he is so adaptable, especially on short notice, isn't the chance that he's now playing, given the patch, and also maybe given the lack of practice time, isn't he theoretically the perfect shoo-in, despite playing a different role for Kiriko?
Yeah, so given that Kiriko is a healer or support, I can't say with certainty that Doha will be filling in for that role. But I also do want to mention that we always leave our options open whenever we play. So there is a chance that he may be filling in. It's just that obviously we have a good support line that perform very well. So maybe he won't be able to play, but I'm not too sure about that. We definitely practice in a very diverse way. So I don't think there's a way to tell as of now.
Now, speaking of supports, I think this season was a very strong one for main supports in the Overwatch League, specifically with Vindame, Charong, and ChiYo coming in. Why did you guys end up going with ChiYo over the other two, which I guess were also on the market?
So I'm not sure if there were many options for strong support, I mean support candidates. But the only reason I went with ChiYo was because during our tryouts, I don't really remember any of the other players doing too well. It's just that ChiYo did better, and he just looked pretty good. So that's why we went with him.
For sure. Now, let's finish off with a couple of questions on playoffs. And I guess one thing is that a playoff patch is expected to come in pretty late. There are a couple of changes in there that, seem to almost be target nerfing the Dallas Fuel. I'm thinking about Zarya nerfs, which Hanbin is very good at. Sombra nerfs. I'm thinking about, I guess, also Genji nerfs, of course. So with that little prep time, is this a problem for the Dallas Fuel?
So not sure what's going to happen with the most upcoming patch for the playoffs, but I think this has always really been a trend ever since a while back. I feel like whenever we find something, obviously we're going to find something that works the best, and I guess that's what's called OP, right? Something that's overpowered, and we would basically abuse what's OP in our perspective. And whenever we do that, the next patch they're just gone. They get nerfed. So I don't know why it's always us that experience that where we find something and then it just gets nerfed the next patch, because we also see some other areas where they could probably apply the patch to balance. There's other OP things that you can find from other teams playing. But I don't think it's going to be a problem. We are pretty confident that we'll perform well despite all the changes.
Is Kiriko OP?
Kiriko, instead of her being OP, I think the better way to put it is she's a really fun hero. I think even as a support player, you're going to have fun playing her. The game's going to be a lot more fun with her, and I personally have been enjoying the game a lot more with her as well.
Right. What does Rush think? Maybe not just for the Dallas Fuel, but generally speaking, looking at the playoff week, will we see her in Overwatch League games? Maybe even if the Dallas Fuel doesn't play it, will other teams?
So it hasn't been a while since. Well, not a lot of time has passed since Kirko was released, and obviously I'm not sure what's going to happen with the patch. But depending on the direction of the patch, I feel like it could be a really chaotic meta. So the next 1 week is going to be very important where the meta will stabilize. So I feel like, we're going to see a lot of different things come out. But after a week, I'm sure that it'll be more standardized and everyone will be using similar comps.
For sure. Then I guess as a last question, it feels like this year, in prior years, it feels like we very clearly had two very strong teams and then probably less strong teams. I'm thinking, season 2, it was clearly Titans Shock. And then, or also even last season, it was probably the Dallas Fuel and the Shanghai Dragons. It's always like two teams going head to head. Feels that's less the case this year. Yes, Gladiators were very good. You guys won a tournament. I think Seoul probably has something to say about that there. Shock looked competitive most of the time and also made it close in some of those tournaments. Is this a closer year? And which team is probably going to give the Fuel the most competition?
I feel like when you say there are like very strong, clear, strong teams, I think I would say that there were more teams that are competing with each other at like similar levels last year as compared to this year. So given that Overwatch 2 is so different based on like the patch and the new heroes this year, it changes a lot of things. But I feel like there were not that many variables last year. So given that there are so many changes that happened so abruptly this year, there are teams that are performing at a high level that lose to maybe a lower tier team. And we've seen that multiple times. But in the end, when you see the overall standings, it's pretty similar. So last year, I'm sure that the top tier teams were actually fighting at a very competitive level amongst each other. I don't think that's the case this year. And regarding which team we will struggle against the most, I don't think there's really anyone.
Right. Then we hope you take that confidence into playoffs week. And thank you for the interview. And of course, also thank you for the translation.
Thank you.
Thank you.